Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Alumni Career Chats. We are still in beta. I'm probably going to say that probably forever, so that people are nice about whether or not I mess up. But we're excited to have here with us today Cal Harris, who is an MPP alum from 2010 and who serves on the alumni board currently. Hi, Cal, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am hanging in there. Before we started recording, we already talked about our children and how hard it is to work. So we've covered that. I had to cut a whole thing about my child when I was talking to Sarah last time. So, how are things? So where are you right now?
So I'm currently in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm here with the family and also working on a gubernatorial campaign. State Auditor Nicole Galloway is running for Missouri governor, and I've had an opportunity to serve as her senior advisor and help out with some of her messaging and speech writing.
Which is awesome, but you are not normally based in Missouri, so you are going back and forth.
Yeah, I'm going back and forth. I also work in DC, and I have a place in Georgetown, and I run the communications shop for the Economic Innovation Group, which is a really fun place to be, especially given some of the economic challenges that our country is facing, and in EIG, their main focus is on place-based solutions. Particularly, they're really big in opportunity zones, also really big in, policies such as heartland visas and other sort of efforts to stimulate entrepreneurism and small business growth and dynamism. So.
Great. And you've been doing that for how long?
I've been doing that since April, since I finished the Michael Bloomberg campaign for president. It was right at the start of COVID-19, so I left New York and came back to DC and took that job at the think tank.
Great. So we are thinking about this being an economic downturn. You're doing two jobs, which is great. Look at you. But this isn't the first time you've worked on a campaign, and you worked in think tanks, you've worked in the private sector. How has it been balancing both of these things?
I'll admit it can be pretty hectic. It's a lot of sleepless nights, but honestly, they both really the experiences really feed off each other.
Okay.
I tell people all the time, working for various think tanks in DC, I used to work in the communication shop for the Bipartisan Policy Center. Now I'm at EIG, and sometimes like you start talking to economists, ivory tower academics, and policymakers, and you start to realize pretty quickly, like how many of them truly haven't, been to middle America, or, you tend to ask, like, when's the last time you've actually talked to a voter? And when I mean voter, I'm not talking about, I believe the latest stat is like, I think like 30% of the country, has a college degree. If the only people you're engaging with on your daily basis are, your other friends that went to Brandeis with you, are other folks who are in that 30%, you're like missing this like large segment of people, who, are facing real challenges, if we're gonna try to create solutions to some of the, difficulties that they're going through and, the matters that are keeping them up at night, it helps to actually like, have them actually articulate their problems for themselves. But then too, a lot of times these folks will tell you exactly what they want. and how they would like to have the problem solved, So it just brings this humility and sort of a broadened perspective to my work, especially because, as we tend to, push out different policy solutions or recommendations, a lot of times, like think tanks, we tend to talk in a bubble, and and I'm like, okay, this is great, this is really good stuff. Like, would someone out in rural Missouri, out in Rawls County, or Perry, Missouri, which I was recently there with the governor, small town, only about 700 people, but like, would they actually be able to read the executive summary, and truly really connect to it, And those are the folks that I tend to think about, when I do the whatever work that I'm doing in the think tank. Like I try to think about, like my relatives, down in rural Arkansas and Mississippi, and folks out in Missouri. These solutions are for them. Like, can they actually connect with this material?
Absolutely. And I imagine as you're talking to people while you're in Missouri, you're talking to a lot of people who probably don't agree with you inherently, right? And we talk about this at Heller all the time, right? Getting people at the table when you're doing something that has a solution, you need to have the people who it's going to affect. But I think we also, and this is not, a Heller problem, it's an ivory tower problem, we still don't want to talk to people who disagree with us, especially when it feels fundamental, right? Especially when we're talking about things like our rights, and protecting vulnerable people. So how do you have those conversations?
Well, it's interesting. So I actually just led a talk with almost about 80 volunteers for our gubernatorial campaign in Missouri. Folks from across the state about engaging voters, in those one-on-one conversations, and it's really weird, but I actually I, I, I actually like framed my approach towards like political communications based on reading a lot of relationship books,
So like
so
dating books?
like marriage counseling books, all the how to keep a happy relationship, how to maintain strong communications. I personally wish I was better at like bringing those lessons into my own life, but they work in politics, so it's totally great. So the thing is, which I think people tend to really forget, is that we are emotional beings. We feel angry, we are afraid, we get frustrated. So like a lot of times, you let's say you meet with folks who don't necessarily agree with you. And their stance on a lot of issues are just, factually inaccurate. Uh, the last thing that I want to do, especially if I'm trying to build some type of trust or credibility with this person, is to like go in, tell them that they're wrong, and proceed to respond to their illogical arguments by just pouring on a bunch of statistics and facts. The acronym I like to use is like people want to know, like, are you with me? Like A, are you accessible? R, are you responsive? And E, are you engaged? And like, and I took this from a relationship book, but
That text right below us.
yeah, so I don't want to get sued there, but that's sort of the type of approach you really need to speak to folks. Like, I mean, imagine you make your partner's upset, they're angry, and in your mind you're like, all right, that person's tripping, but whatever, you know, like you're not gonna like sit there in front of them and just say la 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 la. Like, I mean, if you're really trying to build like an emotional connection, you know, it starts with, okay, tell me what's wrong. Why do you think like that? You know, and it's more like listening and sort of asking a lot of questions more so than like pontificating and preaching and throwing a ton of figures. And I feel like at times, a lot of progressive folks, a lot of we come in with our fancy MPPs and our fancy degrees, and you know, and sometimes we're just like, okay, I'm not engaging with this because it just doesn't make sense, or this is just like factually wrong, you know. But yeah, no, like I mean, sometimes like people just like really want to be heard, you know, and you have a young, 14, no, not 14, 9 months now.
7 months.
Yeah, yeah. When your kid becomes a toddler, when they, come into the room and, they, tell you all these, stories like, oh, there's a monster under my bed, or there's something in my closet, like you're probably not going to have a knee-jerk reaction like, okay, monsters don't exist. You're probably going to say, here, come here. I see you're upset. Give me a hug. Tell me what happened, And I think that's the same amount of patience and sort of understanding that we need to have with folks who don't always agree with us politically or agree with us on different issues. And sort of once you establish that trust and credibility, then you can pontificate and come up with facts, but it starts with building like a real authentic relationship.
That sounds exhausting and really hard.
It's very hard. It takes a lot of patience.
Have you been gaining traction? I mean, you've only been working with the campaign for a few months, but you were telling me before we started recording that she's the only female gubernatorial candidate this year.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like an uphill battle in Missouri. So can you talk about that a little bit?
It's funny. It is an uphill battle. This is a state where there's only one, Planned Parenthood left in the state where you can actually, receive like abortion services. And it's holding on by a thread, like for dear life, like right now, it's like futures being, held up by the courts, we have a long way to go on, women's rights, racial issues, and seen most recently with, Black Lives Matter protesters in St. Louis being confronted by neighbors, wielding, pretty powerful weapons. And then when you, sort of look at some of the LGBTQ policies we have in the state, I mean, we just got a long way to go, So like to have a woman like, Auditor Nicole Galloway, who she's from Fenton, Missouri, which is, it's a pretty rural part as well, but she, doesn't shy away from being pro-choice. She doesn't shy away from saying Black Lives Matter. And she also does not shy away about talking about her faith. It seems like those aren't big things, but in Missouri and in a lot of places in the middle of the country, that means a lot. That means a lot to voters. It shows that she is present and she's comfortable in her own skin. And but also too, she's been really good about I've been really helping the campaign articulate things in a way that really kind of resonates with different folks. And just kind of establishes a stronger connection. So I am really excited. The fact that she is the only woman running for governor on 2020 ballot. I just feel like I got to do everything I can to make sure that she gets across the finish line and can make history for the state.
Wonderful. I hope she wins. How has campaigning changed, right? You were on Bloomberg's campaign, doing this campaign. We have a pandemic. How do you have to pivot in order to campaign successfully?
It's interesting. I mean, well, first of all, let me just say, Bloomberg had a private jet, and
Makes it easier.
like, you know, like the housing accommodations. I mean, Bloomberg campaign was an amazing experience, and I haven't read my NDA in a while, so I'm not sure how much I could talk about that experience.
We
But
can cut it if we have to.
I'm joking. I'm joking. This is totally fine. I think sort of, you know, transitioning from Bloomberg to you know, working with Auditor Galloway in the midst of the pandemic, it has been challenging. You know, you have you know, a lot of folks who um, you know, there's just a lot of misinformation about the virus. It also has really raised a lot of well, shed more light on some of the disparities you know, that are already sort of, you know, in our face, but now sort of front and center. You know, so so you know, it's obviously a big priority for the campaign. It's a big priority for Nicole. It's more than just health. You know, I mean, you know, even in regards to the number of small businesses, you know, across the state that have like had to, you know, close their doors. You know, I'm not sure if you saw. There's the latest stat that, you know, 41% of Black small-owned businesses across the country aren't going to be able to, like, you know, make it through this pandemic and reopen their businesses. You know, and that's really sad. You know, when you look at, you know, PPP, you know, the federal plan to really try to, you know, support a lot of these, you know, small businesses across the country. Looking at, you know, some of like who got money, who didn't, you know, just sort of navigating this whole process, which, you know, again, is very much meant to be a lifeline for a lot of small businesses. But, you know, it's not a silver bullet, you know. At the Economic Innovation Group where I work in DC, we came out with this Neighborhood Poverty Project report, which sort of looks at the evolution of neighborhood poverty from 1980 to, you know, 2018, I believe. It's 2018. I should totally know this stuff, but it looks at the evolution of poverty for over 4 decades. And what's interesting is when you look at the you know, the Great Recession, you know, during, you know, 2008, 2009. What's interesting is, you know, despite the fact that, you know, our national economy has improved, but if you look at the economies that were struggling before the Great Recession, you know, and when you look at some of the, you know, reforms that were meant to really like strengthen our economy, those neighborhoods that were struggling continue to struggle after, you know, those reforms were implemented, you know, and in a lot of cases, those neighborhoods actually got worse, you know, despite the fact that the national economy improved, you know. So what's really funny is you see this dynamic where, you know, you have a pandemic and it's like, you know what, Boston's gonna be okay, you know, New York's gonna be good, Los Angeles, Chicago, they all gonna be all right, you know. But like when you look at like Memphis, Tennessee, Jackson, Mississippi, you know, Birmingham, Alabama, Little Rock, Arkansas, like, you know, some of the places where I've worked on like mayoral campaigns, these are the cities that, you know, are continuously going to get left behind as we're looking at sort of this shiny national ball, thinking that everything's going to be okay. You know, as we start thinking of social policy and we start thinking of, you know, economic, you know, solutions and recommendations, trying to go about things with a more inclusive approach towards economic recovery, make sure that, you know, some of the small towns that I mentioned, you know, some of these southern Midwestern cities, and even like a lot of these rural towns, you know, like we need to make sure that, you know, their future prosperity is front of mind as well, you know. And again, that's, you know, one of the aspects of, my work in the think tank space that I really try to focus on a lot. The fact that, again, poverty in Boston, poverty in New York looks a lot different from poverty out in, rural Arkansas where my mom's from, and those solutions that we come up with, they need to be very intentional. So, that's again, just one of the approaches and one of the things that I kind of, you know, learned just being on various campaign trails and just being, in the trenches with voters. And, I try to bring that approach to my think tank space as well.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder of why local politics is so important. I think
so important. So important.
I mean, we're in a moment of political momentum, I think, for a lot of people. And so I think that, as I'm thinking about this graduating class, we have some alumni who are interested in running for office. We have recent grads who want to get involved in campaigns, who want to get involved in those state and local politics. What advice would you give to them, right? How can they be impactful without completely burning out?
It's funny. Passion is great. What I try to tell people, change is hard. And you're not gonna really change a system overnight. But it will change as long as we are persistent and we don't quit. One thing, and it's probably it's probably not on like firebrand messaging as some people may like. I used to work at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and one of the things I've learned there is that like change, and progress happens in like small incremental steps. It really takes like working together and finding like real common ground to get anything done. And again, like I also try to remind myself, and I tell others that like your perspective matters, but it's also not the only perspective. Sort of like being at a busy intersection and seeing like a car crash in the middle of the intersection. And if I'm standing on the northwest corner of the intersection, you're standing on the southeast corner, we're obviously looking at the same exact accident, but our sort of perspective on what happened and what caused it is going to be completely different from our vantage points. Especially when you start thinking of like how a lot of our backgrounds have really shaped what we see. So yeah, it's like I'm a Democrat. I am strong progressive, but it's like as much as I want change, I want change now. It's hard, and it's sort of like the only way to eat a well is like one bite at a time. So it takes time, but we have to be persistent. So.
Great. We do not advocate eating whales at the Heller Career Center, but thank you for that analogy.
Don't eat whales. Don't do that.
No, this has been really helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, and we'll be sending these out, and I'm sure that students and alumni will get a lot of value from it as well. So I'm gonna stop recording in a second. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Hopefully, I'm happy to, be as, accessible as possible, and, feel free to have folks reach out, and, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. And best of luck for the campaign. I hope the outcome is what we all want.
Yes. I'm really excited about it. And again, no matter what the outcome is, I think like as long as we're out here just like meaningfully engaging people and making them like a real part of like the democratic process beyond the fact of just, treating folks like turnout voters, telling them when, election day is like everybody is a persuadable voter, like as I always say, yeah, Joe Biden and Trump are, on the ballot, but the couch is on the ballot too, and you got to give people a reason to not, stay on the couch. So, and that only comes with creating like real policy agendas that, include everybody.
So true.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cal.
Thank you.